With a really good understanding of Mongoose, the fact that it is the data access layer between our business logic layer and our data persistence, or our long-term storage solution, which is our database management system. In this case, it's Mongo. With the understanding that it is that data access layer, and having set up a little application for us with Mongoose as a dependency for that application, we're ready to go ahead and begin creating our little application that tests out Mongoose and how it works with MongoDB. Now, if you remember, we do have, or should have, if we've watched all the previous videos, we should have both MongoDB installed as well as MongoDB Compass Community, which is the database management application that allows us to log into our local application server, our local database server, and then you should all have a local MongoDB connection saved, which really is just the local host and then the port that it runs on by default, which is 27017. Connect. Once it's connected, we should have our our databases for any applications that we've been working on. Being that this is my development machine, I do have a couple of databases in there that you will not have, but you can just go ahead and ignore those, and then we will go ahead and build up our own database here in a minute. I should have the application open that we created in the last video. And now we're going to go ahead and talk about how we set up this application so that we can use it as just a regular Node desktop terminal application. For that, we need to first make sure that we have an entry point into our application. And when we set the defaults, when we did our npm init, we see that the main file that is the entry point into our application, we decided, based on the defaults, it's called index.js. Some people may call it server.js or app.js or index.js. We're just going to go ahead and leave it at index.js, which means we're going to come back over here to the root of our project folder, click on create a new file, and we are going to create an index.js file, which is going to be our entry to our application. Now, because most of the time, like when we set up a Express application or we're using some kind of a framework, the package.json files that get created by those special executable packages, they usually have a whole lot of startup scripts right here, or test scripts. When you do npm init, it doesn't set those up for you. So we need to go ahead and set up one of our own. So here under scripts, we're going to go ahead and create a start entry. And the value for that key is, of course, going to be what starts our Node application. And we're just going to do node and then ./index.js. And then, of course, our comma right there to make sure we separate these two entries. So here we've got our start command for npm. We're calling node, and we are passing it the entry point into our application, which is this index.js file, which is the index.js file that we just created. You can go ahead and save that. And now we have something that we can run using npm. And to test it, to make sure we got everything set up, we can go ahead in our index.js, do a console.log, and then, hey, my app is running. And then we can go ahead and come down here and do an npm, and then do start. And we can see right here, it begins to run our index.js. And here's our console.log. Hey, my app is running. So we know our application now runs. And of course, being that it is just a regular Node application, once it executes everything inside this file, the application terminates right here. It's not like a server or like an Express app where once we start it, it's going to have a continual loop where it's just listening on a port waiting for HTTP requests. It's going to run and then terminate. So now that we know that that's all running, let's go ahead and change this to initiating Mongoose test. And I'm going to put some stuff around it so that it looks very definitive inside of my console, inside of my terminal. All right, so initiating Mongoose test. And that should be the first thing that gets printed when we spin up this application and we launch it. All right, so now our application is all ready to go. We've got Mongoose installed under our node modules. You can see it right here, Mongoose. And now we can begin talking about how we set up, connect, and use Mongoose inside of our application. But before we can begin using it, the first thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and set up a connection to our MongoDB database. So if we go back to Compass here, right here, we don't have a database set up yet. So what we're going to need to do is we'll probably want to create a database and give it a initial collection that we're going to put stuff in. And so let's go ahead and let's create our database. So we're going to create a database. We are going to call it our, just so we know what it is, let's call it Mongoose _ test _ app. That way we know exactly what application this database belongs to. And in our little test, we are going to, of course, first create users. We are definitely going to want users inside of our application. So we are going to create that initial collection of ours, and we're just going to call it users. And then go ahead and create that database. Now, if we go in and we look at, oops, I clicked on the wrong one. If we click on our Mongoose test app, we should see a collection called users. And if we click on that collection, we will see we do not have any documents in there, which is what we expect because this is a brand new database. So we got our database set up. We've got our initial collection set up, meaning that we are all ready to begin working with Mongoose to insert, update, and delete data inside of that database, particularly users. Now, the first thing we need to talk about is a Mongoose connection string. Now, Mongoose relies on the MongoDB connection string. So if we go to our documentation inside of Mongoose, so we were at Mongoose npm, and then if you go to mongoosejs.com and you look at the API documentation, there is a section wholly on connections, and it tells you how to create connections to a MongoDB using Mongoose. And in here you can see what a MongoDB connection string looks like. And so what we're going to be doing is we are going to first set up what our connection string looks like and what data needs to be in it in order to connect to our local database. And then we're going to then begin setting up Mongoose, all the things that we need in order to make sure that Mongoose interacts with our MongoDB correctly. So let's begin with our connection string. Now, normally in an application, I don't put my connection string directly into my mongoose.connect because my connection string, usually I am pulling my connection string out of some kind of a configuration file or an environment variable. So normally we're not going to hard code it in, but we're going to do that in this application today since it's such a small, simple application. We're just testing. So let's do let connection string. So we're just going to create ourselves a regular string variable. And it, of course, is going to be a string. Now, if we follow this format right here, we're going to be connecting to MongoDB. So we're going to be using the MongoDB protocol indicator inside of our connection string right here. So we're going to do MongoDB, and we have to make sure we spell everything right. So let's go a little bit slower. So we got MongoDB : / so it looks very much like a URL. Now, because we're connecting to our local machine, to our local MongoDB server that's running, we're going to be using 127.0.0.1, which is the IP address for localhost. It's the loopback that comes back to our computer to handle requests instead of going out onto the internet over the network card. And then if you remember, when we connected to our MongoDB using Compass, down here in Compass, we connected using a particular port, and that was 27017. So 27017. So we'll need to add that port here at the end of the IP address so that Mongoose knows or can tell what port it's going to be connecting to. So 27017. And then we need the name of the database. So right after the port, we have a slash, and then we have the name of the database that we are going to be using. And here we called it Mongoose test app. So we'll go ahead and copy that. And if we put that right there, we got the Mongoose test app. And then we've got some configuration options that we're going to put in here to make sure that we can be assured that everything we're trying to write to the database gets written. So let's do retry writes equals true. So that means if for some reason the writing of a document to our database fails due to some kind of a strange connection issue or some other failure, it's going to go ahead and try to rewrite any record that might fail. So let's make sure we spelled that correctly. Retry and then writes equals true. And then the other configuration option we're going to put in there is going to be W equals majority. Now that's a little bit more of an advanced option right there, so we're not going to talk about it right now. That's something that I will leave to you to go investigate and find out why it is in our connection string and what we're going to use it for. Now we've got our connection string. It points to our local host, so to our computer, and then to the port on which our MongoDB database is currently listening. And we know it's listening because we were able to connect to it using Compass. Then we have the name of our database that we're going to be accessing. And then we have a couple of configuration options that are passed in the connection string to make sure, or to tell MongoDB what we want it to do, a couple of extra steps. Right, so that gives us the connection string to our application, or to our MongoDB. And with that, we can now begin to set up our actual Mongoose database connector, so the data access layer, by adding a couple of additional configuration options to Mongoose. So the first things first, though, when we looked at our documentation, we have to pass our connection string to Mongoose itself, and we have to pass it to the connect function inside of Mongoose. So if we go back to our IDE here, our application, because we're going to be passing it to Mongoose, that implies that we, of course, are going to need to have Mongoose imported into our application to begin with. So let's go up here, and I always like to put my imports or my requires up at the top of my files. So we're going to do const mongoose equals require, and then we are going to specify the Mongoose library that was just put in with npm. So now we've got Mongoose in here running. Now one thing too is that a lot of times we like to use dates inside of our applications or inside of anything that we're storing, like the date it was created, the date that it was removed or deleted or updated. So I always like to, when I'm dealing with Mongoose and I know I'm going to be storing data and that data will potentially have dates in it, I like to use a third-party library, which I think is really good, called Moment. And it makes handling dates in JavaScript extremely easy. So we're going to come down here into our terminal and we're going to do an npm install moment -- save. And that's going to go ahead and install the moment time library in there for us. And then I'm going to go ahead and import it. So const moment equals require. And then we're going to go ahead and pull in the moment library so that we have it available to us anytime we need to deal with dates. All right, so now that we've got Mongoose installed, we've got a library for helping us with dates. We've got our connection string. Now we need to go ahead and set up Mongoose in order to do what we want it to do as it connects to the MongoDB and it begins to interact with the data. So there's a couple of connections, a couple of configurations we're going to do before we pass the connection string. So let's do mongoose.set, and we are going to do use unified topology. We're going to set that one to true. Now, what does this one do for us? We're going to go ahead and put a note above it so we know what this does for us. So there is there's always the chance that as a technology evolves and grows up and becomes more complex and more used, and as it changes, things happen. And so there was an old server, so we're going to put in here server discovery and monitoring engine that was used by Mongoose and MongoDB. Well, it was used by MongoDB, and it has been deprecated. You're going to hear that word a lot, deprecated. It means that it's no longer being used, but they do have options in there to still use it if you want. And so here, we're just going to go ahead and, because we don't want to be dealing with deprecated tools or infrastructure, we're going to go ahead and set it to true so that we can use the new version of server discovery and monitoring. So let's go ahead and say set to true. Our app will use the latest and greatest. All right. So if you want to dive deeper into what I mean by everything I just said, go for it. Otherwise, just know that you'll probably want to have this setting set like this before you have Mongoose connect. So let's do mongoose.set again. And this time we are going to do use create index. We're going to go ahead and set this one to true as well. And let's go ahead and talk about what this one does for us so that we have a basic understanding of it. So normally this is false, so it's false by default. But if we want to make Mongoose's default index use create index instead of ensure index, so false by default, when set to true, the index, the default index, when it gets created, so default index creation will use create index instead of ensure index. Now, we haven't really talked about indexing. And so because we haven't really talked about indexing, really all you need to know is that an index within a DBMS, whether it be relational or document database, indexing content inside of the database ensures that we can locate that data within the database more quickly and pull it back. So it kind of helps speed up retrieval of data. And it's usually, indexes are usually created on data that is unique. So such as the unique ID of a document once it gets inserted in the database. That particular field will have an index. So this just has to do with the functionality of indexing within the database. So you don't really need to understand it too much right now, but do know that indexes get automatically created, and you can force create indexes in order to ensure the speed of locating documents based on unique data that documents may have inside of them. All right. So then we also have mongoose.set, and then we are going to do use find and modify, and we're going to set that to false. And then let's go ahead and talk about what this one does. So it's true by default, and when it is set to false, the find one and update function, this is one that we'll use all the time, as well as the, let's go ahead and go to another line since our text is so big, the find one and remove functions will use a native find one and update, as well as a find one and remove, instead of, let's see, it'll use a native one instead of find and modify. Now, this is a preference of mine. Really, we're not going to go deep into this, but this is a preference that I have set whenever I'm dealing with a MongoDB, just because I like the native find one and update option rather than the find and modify. You'll have to learn about that and decide what you like when you do it. Now, another important one that we got here is the mongoose.set, and then we are going to do a use new URL parser. We're going to set that to true. And the reason why we're going to use this new one is the underlying MongoDB driver that sits underneath Mongoose. Now remember, Mongoose is that data access layer that sits on top of MongoDB and passes data to and from it across the network. Well, there was an underlying MongoDB driver that has been deprecated, and because it's been deprecated, the parsing of the URL for connecting to the database and parsing out these options that we have in here, we need to use the new one. So it's just simply we're forcing the use of the new one. All right. So we're not going to go deep into that. These are some settings that you can go learn more about, but really we're just forcing that the URL parser for this right here, for the connection string URL, is being used, or it's using the new parsing function rather than a deprecated function, parsing function. Now with those all set up and done, now we can finally go ahead and make the connection. So we do mongoose.connect. And then in here, we're going to pass that connection string. And that right there, when we do a mongoose.connect, an important thing to notice is that it returns to us a promise, a JavaScript promise. So if you don't remember JavaScript promises, they have the format of .then, and inside of this .then, we can handle the successful connection of the database, or to the database. And then with a .catch, we can handle any errors that might come back from this connection attempt. So again, then is for successful connections. So let's go ahead and note that. Note connection success. And then down here in the catch, this is when a connection fails. So, right. Let's go ahead and close this terminal down so we have more space here. Right. So in here, we're going to handle anything. So of course, just like that, promises, they require us to provide a function handler. So we're going to use an anonymous function in the form of a arrow function right here. And so inside of this area right here, inside of this arrow function's body, this is where we would begin to do stuff with our database because we know we have connected. So let's go ahead and note that so we know in the future. So note all work with MongoDB must happen after a successful connection. And that would be done here. And then if we have a failure, just like the then, we have to handle that with an anonymous function. And here we're going to use an arrow function. So we're going to do an error, because we'll get an error back from MongoDB translated by Mongoose to tell us what happened with the connection. And then we can just go ahead and, in our application, since we're keeping it pretty simple, we're just going to do a console.log, and then we are going to say an error has occurred. And then we will go ahead and print out the error, just like that. Now up here, if we wanted to, we can go ahead and do a console.log and then let everybody know that the connection was successful. So now we're telling everybody that it was successful. We're going to print that out to our screen. Okay, with this, we now have everything set up to connect to our local MongoDB, connect to our Mongoose test app database, and we are ready to handle both failures as well as successful connections to the database. This puts us in a good place to begin working with Mongoose models and schemas and seeing how we can begin to put data in, pull data out, modify data, delete data, and query for data. So we're going to go ahead and stop now, and in the next video we will move on to actually working with the Mongoose schema and models.